Good afternoon, and welcome to Session 2 of the 2020 Autism Hope Summit. My name is Rachel Corney, and I am a research assistant here at STAR, and I'll be your moderator for this session. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please hit the Ask a Question blue box at the bottom of the screen, and there'll be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. This hour's presentation is titled Developing Effective Skills in Self-Advocacy and Disclosure, a workshop for people with autism, and is presented by Dr. Stephen Shore. Dr. Shore was diagnosed with atypical development and strong autistic tendencies, and was non-speaking until the age of 4. He has since earned his Doctor of Education at Boston University, is currently a full-time professor at Adelphi University and adjunct at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. Stephen is also an internationally renowned educator, consultant, and author on lifespan issues related to education, relationships, employment, and self-advocacy. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for a great introduction. And let us begin with sharing my screen. And here we go. So, self-advocacy, and what goes into effective self-advocacy. And that's what we're going to explore today. It's important because there are many times that we come up against challenges that we need to address, and we need to communicate these challenges. We need to communicate our needs for modification or greater mutual understanding. And it needs to be done in a way that others can understand and then provide support. It also requires that we understand what it means to us to be autistic. How do our autistic characteristics play into with whatever environment that we happen to be in? So when we think about self-advocacy, my question always is, what are we doing now to prepare for successful self-advocacy? And this is throughout the lifespan. It's never too early to start thinking about how we can educate an autistic person to effectively advocate on their own. And it all begins with an awareness of the need. So when do we need to advocate? When are we coming up against a situation that strikes us in an area that we're challenged? Whether it's environmental, maybe we need a different type of lighting. Maybe there's too much noise in the environment. Maybe there's something else that's affecting our sensory system. Possibly it has to do with the way we think, the way we perceive the world. Maybe we need to receive information in a way that's different than it's being provided. So instead, for example, of expecting us to remember a lot of information or a long string of instructions presented verbally, maybe we do better if it's written down. And then how do we bring that need across to another person? And then there is social emotional, so interacting with others. What are some differences that we have? Perhaps difficulty in perceiving nonverbal communication or perceiving the world in a very literal type of fashion. And maybe we need to make other people aware of this. And this is where we get into the next step, which is the advocacy effort. So how are we going to communicate this need? Is it going to be through spoken word like we're doing now? Is it going to be written? Is it going to be another form of communication? And then when we advocate, we have to give a reason why. Why are we asking for greater mutual understanding? And or do we need a modification in the environment? And that's the disclosure piece. And all of this goes into developing a successful advocacy plan. And this is a vital part that allows us to lead a fulfilling and productive interdependent life. And I focus on the word interdependent. So often we hear about the need for developing skills in independence. However, last time I checked, only hermits live independently. The rest of us depend on others to lead fulfilling and productive lives, to do things that either we're not good at or we don't want to do, whether we're autistic or not. So nobody gets down on you saying that you need to develop your skills in independence if you didn't build the chair you're sitting in, or if you didn't fly an airplane. Not that people are doing much of that these days, but people don't expect you to fly your own airplanes for the most part, or fix your own cars. We depend on other people to do these things. So interdependence, I think, is a better way to look at it. And advocacy is a common thread for success in all aspects of life, such as education, involvement in the community, relationships of all sorts, where we're living, residential situation, and employment as well. So as we think about advocacy, there are basically two types. There's individual advocacy, which is when we advocate for ourselves for some reason, but there's also group advocacy. So what is individual advocacy? That is when we're making our own needs known in a way that others can understand and provide support, whereas group advocacy is in a way that others can understand and provide support. So that's a dimension of advocacy that's important to consider. So as we think about advocacy, one frequent area of advocacy that I see is how do we identify ourselves? Do we identify as being autistic, or do we have autism? And which is the right way to do it? Well, I remember when I first started getting involved in the autism community, I was struck by the fact that many people were referring to themselves as autistic individuals. Well, aren't we supposed to be using person-first language and recognizing the individual as a person first who happens to have something? And so I brought this question up for discussion at a conference some years ago. We got about 100 people on the spectrum in a room, and there was good discussion. One person said, for example, that they identify with being autistic. Being autistic affects everything that they do. That's not all they are, but being on the spectrum, it does color every aspect of their lives. And then somebody else says, well, autism isn't something that you have like a loaf of bread. Autism isn't something that I can put into a bag, for example, put it on a chair, and hopefully I won't forget my bag of autism when I leave the room. Yet another person said that they'd rather be recognized for the humanity, for the person they are, and then who happens to have something. And then somebody else responded to that saying, well, if we consider autism as an extension of the diversity of the human gene pool, then we're just as human as anybody else. So it went back and forth, and finally we voted. And the vote came down into 80% in favor of identity first language, so autistic individual. However, there certainly were a number of people who preferred person first. So we wrote up a proclamation, and it went something like this. Most of us prefer identity first language. We'll try not to have a meltdown if you use the one that we don't prefer to use. And finally, when in doubt, Just ask the individual. So, and even today, I find that most people on the spectrum prefer identity-first language. However, we need to be respectful of people who prefer person-first language as well. So what brings me here to talk about autism to you? I mentioned that this morning during my keynote presentation. And one thing I'd like to focus on is, as I was taking apart watches, my parents made a big deal about that, providing watches to take apart and letting me know that I had a real skill in this area. And this is important because doing so sets the stage for self-determination. And self-determination is what allows us to act as the driver of our own lives. Not somebody else. Certainly we can get advice from other people, but we're the ones who should be making our own decisions. And we need to know where our strengths are. We need to know where our challenges are in order to successfully do that. So building the self-awareness is an important first step to eventually getting to disclosure. And so often people ask me, when is the right time to tell an autistic person that they're autistic? And my response to that is, it's never too early to start thinking about it. Commonly, this is something that occurs often around age 6. A child may ask, why do I have such a hard time making friends? Why is physical education so difficult? And things like that. What makes me different? Why do I have to see the special doctor every week? Well, I was lucky in this regard because my parents used the word autism in the house for as long as I can remember. So since about age 5.5, I knew I had this thing called autism. Didn't know much about what it was, but it certainly helped explain an awful lot of differences. However, what I find is that many people don't learn about being autistic this way. So how do you tell somebody that they're on the spectrum? Well, let's take an example. How do we disclose to somebody that they're autistic? And what about being autistic makes it challenging to disclose? And what makes it even more challenging to disclose than, say, someone who has cerebral palsy or who is a paraplegic and has to navigates the world in a wheelchair and is enabled by that wheelchair to get around. And you might notice that I didn't say confined to a wheelchair, because a wheelchair is a device that helps that person who has difficulty using their legs to successfully get around. So a lot of this is how we look at the differences and the challenges that we face. So what about autism? What makes it particularly challenging to disclose and to talk about? And part of it is that autism is considered as an invisible disability, an invisible difference. And that is, you can't see it. People tend to believe what you can see. However, us autistic people, we look just like anybody else. And so do people with ADD and with other neurological differences. We look the same physically. And that can make it hard because people expect others to be, for lack of better terminology, normal. And then when something bangs up against one of our challenges and autism shows its face, you might say, then people start, it often confuses people. So autism actually, as a result, autism and the other invisible differences actually potentially gather more stigma than visible differences. And that's something that's talked about by Irving Goffman in his book, Stigma, The Management of Spoiled Identity. So that's part of what makes it so difficult to disclose. And when we do disclose, sometimes we get ridiculous responses such as, well, you don't look autistic. Well, what does autistic look like? It's a neurobiological difference. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. And when we're talking about autism, whether we're disclosing to another person or if we are telling a person on the spectrum that they're on the spectrum. And an important reason why we need to do this, we need to learn effective skills in self-advocacy, is because most people are just busy with living. They're not in the mindset of accommodating people with differences. In grade school, it's a little bit different. Part of a teacher's job, as dictated by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is to notice when students are having more difficulty than would be expected in class. And if that's the case, then that person is referred for assessment to see if they have a special need and if they're entitled to special education supports. So that's part of a teacher's job, to notice when students may be having more difficulties, and then to provide accommodations for students who have disabilities, who are categorized in one of the 13 federal categories of disabilities, autism being one of those. Once we graduate school, once we are older than 18, there is no more Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And what takes over is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Americans with Disabilities Act does provide us with accommodations in college, at work, in the community. However, one of the biggest differences between the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act is that the ADA is it's a self-serve model. You have to advocate for yourself. Whereas in grade school, the teacher and the system advocates for you. Once you get into college, or at least once you graduate high school, you're essentially on your own when it comes to obtaining accommodations and greater understanding. You have to advocate for yourself. So for example, as a college teacher, it is not my job to notice when students perhaps may have a disability and if they're in need for greater accommodation. Well, since I'm interested in such things, I do notice when this happens, but most professors don't look for such things and only make accommodations when they get a notice from the school disabilities office. So for example, if I notice a student, I may notice that a student is having challenges that are consistent with autism. I cannot say to that student, well, would you stay after class for a few minutes? You're looking pretty autistic today. However, don't worry, I've got dozens of accommodations that we can look at so that you have an equal chance of success in my class as everybody else. Professors don't do that, supervisors don't do that. I think it might even be illegal for me to do that. So what has to happen at the college level is that a student has to find the disabilities office themselves. Sometimes it's called the Office of Student Success or Student Support, but whatever the name is, every university that receives federal funding in some way has to have an office dedicated to supporting people with disabilities. And then it's up to that student to advocate for themselves as to what accommodations they need. So again, good reason to be learning about effective self-advocacy. So as I mentioned, it begins with the person understanding what it means to them to be autistic. So let's take an example of how that works. Again, I was lucky in this regard because my parents used the word autism in the house for as long as I can remember. I don't have any memories of not being autistic, except maybe when I was really young, like 2.5 years old, when I had become non-speaking. And I do have some memories of back then, but not of being autistic. Just that's how things were. So let's take a look at an example of a 4-step approach I developed to help a person on the spectrum understand that, number one, they are autistic, and then number two, what it means to them. So let's take an example of a child I started working with at age 5.5, giving him music lessons. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. His parents refused to use the word Asperger's syndrome in the house because they just knew with enough intensive activity, we'd early interventionize the autism right out of him. Well, we fast forward to his teenage years and he's still autistic. Perhaps it's even more noticeable now because the developmental differences between typically developing children and those on the spectrum become wider. And notice I say differences as opposed to delays, because while most people in the medical model tends to focus on the disabilities and the delays and the deficits, there also may be areas where we develop faster than the typical person. So I like to use the word difference. So his parents realized that this autism thing was here to stay and that the child needed to be told. They asked me to do the deed. I agreed to do it. So we started the next session talking about his strengths in music, graphic design, and computers. We talked about his challenges in making friends, penmanship, and physical education. And he got this pretty quickly. This first step we can start pretty early as we start to communicate to the student or to the child. This is where you're really good. These things you're really good at, taking apart watches or whatever it might be. And I know some of these other areas can be challenging. Get that person used to the idea that they've got some skills in some areas, and well, sure, certainly there's challenges in others. And that brings us to the second step, which is racking up strengths and challenges. Putting the strengths on one side of a piece of paper, the challenges on another, and then seeing if we can draw a line from a strength to accommodate for a challenge. Well, this student, he was a penmanship disaster area, but he was really good on computers. So let's just use the computer to write you papers from now on. And he thought that was a pretty good idea. So always look for a strength to accommodate for a challenge, one or more strengths to accommodate for challenges. And also, you might notice there's a word I haven't used yet in today's presentation. And that is when we think about strengths. We only need to take a look at the IEP for this. We also think about the contrasting weaknesses. Well, I prefer to use the word challenge rather than weakness, because weakness is a static word. It kind of puts it's a sense of putting the blame on the person. And there isn't much you could do about it. Too many negative connotations. But a challenge suggests that this is something that you can work through, you can work over, you can work around. You can also make a considered decision to ignore a challenge. So, for example, what I find very challenging are noisy places. I'm pretty low functioning in a noisy bar. Too much sensory input, too much nonverbal communication. Now, I know that there are strategies that I could engage in to address the auditory sensitivities. Maybe I could go to the biomedical folks and get some magnesium. I heard that can help with hearing sensitivities. I could wear some ear protection. I could learn more about nonverbal communication. Or I could just decide that I can lead a fulfilling and productive life by just not going into these noisy bars. And so that's what I choose to do. So you can make a considered decision to just ignore a challenge and to do something else. Third step is non-judgmental comparison. And that is, we take a look at characteristics of other people he knows. In this case, it was the child's father, sister, friends. And the idea is that different people have different strengths, different challenges. Nobody's better than anybody else. And we use our strengths to lead fulfilling and productive lives. Perhaps we take a look at some well-known role models. Many people think Bill Gates is autistic, and he seemed to do okay with his computer business. And there's many other people who we either know are autistic or we suspect they may be autistic. And then figures who have passed away a long time ago, such as Michelangelo, some people who say Beethoven, Einstein, and so on. There's no way that we can determine if they were autistic, but we can consider the characteristics that might line up with the autism spectrum. Then before presenting the label, I talk about scientists and doctors who study people's characteristics. And it just so happens to be that your set of characteristics line up with what is known as Asperger's syndrome. Well, this was a fast disclosure. It took us about 20 minutes to get to this point. He said, enough of this, can we get back to the lesson? And so we did. I didn't know if my student understood what we talked about. A few weeks later, I asked his father, how did your son do with the disclosure? His dad said that his son loves having Asperger's syndrome. And that's probably because he now realizes why he is the way he is. And in this way, the label summarizes a condition rather than being an anxiety-producing name for a set of deficits. So often, disclosure to an autistic person is done backwards, where the word autism is mentioned first, and then there's a whole bunch of anxiety and fear that has to be worked around before we can start talking about strengths and challenges. Whereas if we get the person comfortable with their profile and then say, well, this is what it adds up to, I find that tends to work much better. And this is what sets the stage for effective self-advocacy. There's more about it in this book. I guess just the best thing to say is that I'm the dummy who wrote this book. This is also something that can be done on both a class-wide and individual level, taking a look at likes and dislikes, whether you're talking with one person or even talking with a class. Either way, we can talk about things that we like and that make things easier, life easier, and things that we dislike. And so the sensory realm is usually the easiest to talk about. Everybody can think about food that they like. Everybody can think about food that grosses them out, and various other types of sensory input. When done in a class situation, it's a non-threatening way to start talking about differences that people have, and just as they are, categorical differences. The person who gets grossed out by Jell-O isn't any better or worse than the person who likes Jell-O. It's just a difference. And we can also explore these differences in the cognitive realm. What do you find difficult? What do you find easy? And we can also do this in this social emotional realm as well. And as students become more comfortable talking about their differences in a class situation, this also helps to reduce bullying, as students also begin to understand that there's differences between them and they're perfectly fine. I did a workshop covering this material in a school in the Bronx some years ago. And I remember one of the students suddenly piped up and said, well, you know, I have a strain of autism. So I don't know what he meant by a strain of autism, but he looked pretty Aspergerish to me. We can also talk about likes and dislikes, which can also be correlated to strengths and challenges. by looking at it graphically. And what I sometimes do is I draw a graph like this on the board with the blue line signifying average. And we look at strengths, we look at challenges. I may pull the class and say, okay, how many of you are good at math? Raise your hand. And get some hands. How many of you wish you were better at math? Get some more hands. And we can do this about any subject, whether it's in school or outside of school. So what is the difference between someone who has a disability and someone who doesn't? Because everybody's got strengths and everybody's got challenges. And the difference will be is that the challenges will go much deeper than what we see here. Perhaps the graph will go to the floor or to the basement. So the person who wishes they were better at math in school, assuming they don't have a math disability, their math will be good enough to get them through their daily lives. A person who has a math disability, like a colleague of mine at Adelphi University, she's so challenged in the area of math that she's learned a long time ago not to have a checkbook because it just doesn't work. She can't conceive of money going in and out of her account if she doesn't actually see it. So it's cash only for her, and she advocates for herself whenever she comes up against a challenge related to math. Now, that said, a characteristic of autism is a widely varying skill set. So what that also means is that while there may be significant challenges, there's also going to be some really significant strengths or abilities. And this particular friend of mine, her abilities go shooting through the roof. She's got all A's in her doctoral courses, except for two of them. One of them was statistics, and the other one is quantitative research, again, numbers. But everything else, she's just stellar at. She gives presentations like I do. She travels, she does research, she writes, and does everything a doctoral student, soon to be a researcher, does, and does it very well. So incredible strengths combined with incredible challenges. And this will be important later as we talk about effective self-advocacy. And we can mark off the students who raise their hand for their strengths with check marks and those with challenges with check marks towards the bottom. When planning for disclosure, or either to tell somebody that they're autistic, or if you're going to tell someone that you're autistic, sometimes it can be helpful to write it down in a form that looks very much like this. And you can refer to this as your notes. Or maybe even work with somebody on the spectrum who you're working on the disclosure piece by writing down with them strengths and challenges. And if they are non-speaking and use pictures, then we can just paste pictures or attach pictures to these same areas. So how do we disclose to Ted that he has Asperger's syndrome? 7-year-old Ted has been asking why classmates make fun of him during recess. He sees an occupational therapist every week, takes him a whole class period to copy just a few words from the board, and he's clumsy in gym. He's been asking these questions more and more frequently. You also notice that Ted seems to have lost interest in composing music and using the computer. Ted's teacher notices that he no longer helps his classmate Deb in mathematics in exchange for assistance in creative writing. Somehow Deb has the ability to help Ted organize his thoughts for creative writing assignments that nobody else could, including the paraprofessional. Now it's time to tell Ted he has Asperger's syndrome. So how are we going to help Ted's parents plan their disclosure to their son that he has Asperger's syndrome? Emphasizing the strengths, but at the same time being realistic about the challenges. So here are the 4 steps: strengths and challenges. What is Ted good at? He seems to be good at music, at computers, at mathematics. And at the same time, we recognize that he has challenges with creative writing, physical education, and penmanship. And we look for ways that he can use his strengths, perhaps in computers, to do his writing, just like I talked about earlier with the example that I gave, as we're racking up the strengths and the challenges. We can compare strengths and challenges, such as Deb. She has challenges in math. And isn't it great that Ted helps her in math? And at the same time, Deb has some really good strengths in creative writing. And when Ted is comfortable with understanding his profile, then we can bring up the label, because now it becomes an explanation for why things are the way they are. So that brings us to self-advocacy. And self-advocacy depends on, again, understanding what does it mean to you? What does it mean to me to be autistic? So let's take an example of what advocacy is. You're lost and you ask for someone for directions. You don't have a GPS with you, or you don't have your phone and you can't look it up on your own. So you ask, how do I get there? And here's the set of directions. And let us suppose that, well, you're just not going to remember all of that. What are you going to do? So you go through a 3-step process, which most people probably don't even realize this is what they're doing. First, you realize there's too much information for you to remember. Then you advocate for your needs. What do you need? Well, you need a little more, you need a few moments to get something to take this down. Maybe it's on an iPad, an iPhone, or maybe just a piece of paper and pen or a pencil. And then you got to give a reason why. I'm not going to remember it all. Thanks for waiting. What you've done is you've scanned the environment for challenges. You've recognized the challenge, in this case, too much information. You've advocated for yourself in a way that somebody else could understand and provide support. You didn't have a meltdown. You didn't bite the person who's going to give you this information. You didn't pull their hair. You didn't hit them, but you just asked them for an accommodation, in this case of time, maybe 30 seconds or so, to get something to take this down. And then you gave the reason why. And in that way, this person, autistic or otherwise, has engaged in a 3-step process of effective self-advocacy. So let's put this in a situation that might be more familiar to one of us. Many of you may think that this hat's a fashion statement. And I guess it is. It's always good to support your university whenever you can. However, it's really an accommodation, because for me, being under recessed lighting fixtures is probably like looking into a spotlight for most other people. So this is one thing that autism means to me, unable to tolerate recessed lighting fixtures. So here's the accommodation, and that's about it. Let us suppose I am in a work situation. My supervisor is showing me a new office space. It's an open office, and it's lit with recessed lighting fixtures. So as always, I'm scanning the environment for lighting. I also scan the environment for noise, such as if a restaurant, well, I guess we're not eating in too many restaurants these days, but when we used to eat in restaurants, I'd scan restaurants for noise. If they were too noisy, I'd either just not eat in that restaurant or ask for a quieter place to sit down. So anyways, I've scanned the environment. I noticed there's recessed lighting fixtures. Recessed lighting fixtures and I don't get along. And now it's time to clearly advocate to my supervisor and say, well, you know, I see that nobody in the office is wearing a hat. However, I wonder if it's okay if I wear my hat in the office. So there it is, 1 or 2 sentences, easy for the supervisor to understand and provide support. And they don't even need to provide anything, because I've got my own hat. Well, if I'm going to ask for a modification, such as wearing a hat when nobody else is, perhaps there's some sort of unwritten rule that you don't wear a hat at work, I've got to give a reason why, and that's the disclosure piece. And in this case, I would probably say, you know, these lights, they hurt my eyes, they give me a headache, I must have sensitive eyes. Now what I did is what is known as a partial disclosure. A partial disclosure. I just talked about the specific aspect of autism that is affecting the situation. And most of the time, a partial disclosure is all we need. Disclosing the full disclosure of an autism diagnosis, it may be too much information, it may be distracting, and may confuse the supervisor who doesn't know much about autism. Maybe they watched Rain Man, but that's pretty much all they know about autism. And if I'm really on top of my game, maybe I'll even throw in a benefit for the supervisor and for the company in general. If I can wear my hat and not have a headache when I work in this room, then I will be much more productive for your office as a result. So that's a very simple example of self-advocacy. And what is self-advocacy? It's knowing when and how to approach others in order to negotiate desired goals, to build better mutual understanding, fulfillment, and productivity. And with disclosure, there's a certain amount of disclosure, with self-advocacy, there's a certain amount of disclosure that goes along with it. Because again, if you're asking for an accommodation or understanding, then you've got to give a reason why. And often people ask, when do I decide to advocate? And I think it starts with recognizing that when the effect of being autistic or having another condition significantly impacts a situation or a relationship, and there's a need for better mutual understanding, then it's time to build an advocacy plan. So if there's nothing affecting me that's related to autism, there's nothing to advocate for. So let's take some examples. Let us suppose I'm teaching mathematics or statistics. Does it make sense for me to disclose that I am on the autism spectrum? Is there anything about autism that significantly impacts my relationship with the students? Well, it doesn't seem to affect my teaching ability. It doesn't seem to affect my ability to call on students, to answer questions. So maybe the answer is no. But then again, as I think more about it, maybe there is something to disclose. And one aspect of autism, at least for me, means difficulty in facial recognition. That's pretty common for us. So what the implications as a professor is that it takes me all period to begin to recognize my students. So what I might say to my students is, if it looks like I don't recognize you outside of class or even inside of class, it's because I don't. And the reason why is that I'm really bad at remembering faces. And then the advocacy, so that I disclosed first in this case, the advocacy piece is, it will be helpful to me if you wear a name tag or use your name tent, or outside of class if you identify yourself outside of class. Yes, so that I realize that you're one of my students. So there was the advocacy. And again, it was a partial disclosure. What about a full disclosure? Well, it might not make too much sense to disclose that I'm on the autism spectrum, unless maybe a student came up to me after class and said, well, gee, my brother, you know, he's got autism and he doesn't recognize anybody, including me, and I'm his sister. Well, that person may have a little bit more knowledge about what autism is, and a full disclosure might be appropriate there. Or let us suppose I'm teaching a course such as diagnosis and intervention in autism spectrum conditions. like I teach during the summer at my university. Well, in this case, a full disclosure is appropriate because being on the autism spectrum significantly impacts the situation and my relationship with the students. So developing an advocacy plan. This is a book I edited on self-advocacy, ask and tell, because I realized that nobody was talking about or educating those of us on the autism spectrum to effectively advocate. So I got 5 of my colleagues together, all on the autism spectrum, to write a chapter on how they best felt those of us on the autism spectrum could be taught how to effectively advocate. And so that's where this book comes from. If we take a look at one of the chapters written by Cassiana Sibley, she identified stages, developmental stages to self-advocacy. And she identified 6 stages to self-advocacy. Now, here are the first 3, because she realized that people aren't born just knowing how to advocate, but this is something that may need to be taught through direct instruction, very much like learning nonverbal communication or sometimes social interaction. Us autistic people often need direct instruction in this area. So in the early stages, it may be helping a person plan for their advocacy and then showing that person, now that we've decided what we're going to advocate and how we're going to advocate, now I'm going to show you how it's done, and you observe. And as you move up the developmental stages, more and more of the responsibility for advocating gets placed on the budding self-advocate until we get to stage 6, where a person would be at such a level where they'd come across a situation, maybe like with the lighting that I described earlier. They've developed their own advocacy plan, they've implemented that plan, and then they come back to you and tell you, this is what happened, and I think it worked well, or maybe something could have been improved. So that 3-step process for effective self-advocacy. We've got a 10-year-old student in an inclusive classroom, Samantha, who knows that she's been upset for the past week. Through discussion with Samantha and classroom observation, you find that there's a group of students who take a lot of fun in watching Samantha squirm as they lightly touch her in the hopes of getting her to strike out and get blamed for starting a fight. Since they're bullies, they time it in such a way that only when the teacher turns around, they see Samantha hitting the students who are bothering her in the first place. What these students are doing are taking advantage of her tactile hypersensitivity. Those of us who are tactily hypersensitive to touch, sometimes we wiggle in some kind of interesting ways if we're unexpectedly touched, and that's what these students were looking for. So you're someone who supports Samantha, and you decide, okay, I'm going to talk to her teacher, and the teacher is understanding, and we'll have it straightened out in 2 minutes. And you do talk to her teacher, and the teacher, you and the teacher sort it out, and the bullies aren't going to bother her anymore. However, you decide maybe it's time to start teaching Samantha how to effectively advocate on her own. So how would you use that 3-step process for self-advocacy? And what stage of those 6 stages is Samantha at? Well, if she hasn't advocated for herself previously, she might be at stage 1. So it would begin with talking with Samantha and validating, recognizing her need for support and her sense of frustration at having to deal with these bullies. And you could work out a plan with her. You'd brainstorm. What are some things we could do to help the situation out? We could punch the bullies in the nose, but you get in trouble when you fight in school. And besides, we shouldn't be expecting Samantha, who has the least amount of power in a bullying situation, to be doing most of the work. Eventually, you get around to setting up a meeting with Samantha's teacher and working it out through the teacher. So you make that appointment with that teacher. Samantha comes along, and perhaps you open up the meeting with the teacher. Samantha and I are coming to you with a problem. Samantha appears to be being bullied by some of her classmates. This is what's going on. And let's see if we can come up with some suggestions. Samantha's suggestion is that the bullies be moved to another seat, or that Samantha gets moved to another seat away from the bullies. And that way Samantha can see what is, how advocacy takes place. If Samantha is at one of the other stages of self-advocacy, maybe you'd start out by saying, Samantha would like to talk to you about a problem she's having in class. Samantha, would you like to tell your teacher what is happening? And then however Samantha communicates via spoken word, like we're doing now, through picture exchange communication systems, an assistive communication device, whatever it is, then she gets into a conversation with her teacher to advocate for herself, and you're there to fill in and provide support should Samantha get stuck. If she's all the way at number 6, then you probably would find out that Samantha has already advocated for herself and the result of that advocacy after it's done, because that's when she would tell you. So that's an example of self-advocacy. Now, during the keynote, I talked about skipping jazz band rehearsals because the trumpets were just too loud behind me. In those days, the concept of sensory issues or autism, there wasn't much known about them at all. So I'm not sure if any amount of advocacy would have worked. However, these days, had they known then what they know today, I could have gone to that band teacher, talked about sensory issues, and presented some possibilities for alleviating those sensory issues, perhaps using an alternative seating chart for the jazz band, or maybe getting some sort of ear protection. So continuing to look at advocacy and how it's done. Again, the first thing you're doing is you're scanning the environment for challenges in one of these 3 realms. What is your perception of the environment is the question. Cognitively, how do we think? And social cues, how do we feel? How do we explain our needs in a way that somebody else can understand and provide support? And then we have to give a reason why. So we're always looking to determine what is causing a difficulty in a particular situation. How can we explain our needs in a way that promotes greater understanding and that another person can provide assistance in the situation? And then the disclosure piece. Is it a partial disclosure, or is it a full disclosure? So in developing your advocacy plan, you can use a chart very much like this and write down what you're looking for in terms of the challenge. Maybe it's the lighting. Maybe I need to have information presented to me in a different way, be it in school or be it at work. How am I going to explain these needs? And then finally, what are the reasons? So if it's sensory, fluorescent lights might be one. If it's cognitive, remembering verbal instructions. Maybe we can request that the instructor provide written information. And the disclosure might be, I remember things better when I write them down. And this would be a good way to get information at work if someone's giving you a long list of directions on how to do a job or run a particular machine. Sometimes we can be very literally minded and have a hard time decoding jokes. Maybe asking fellow students to let you know when they're making a joke. And again, we're going with a partial disclosure. I take things very, very literally. So as we think about self-advocacy, effective self-advocacy, another way to look at it is it's sort of like constructing a house. You start out with a foundation of self-awareness, which allows you to scan the environment for challenges that you happen to have. You're always asking the question, what is causing the challenge? What domain is that challenge in? And then noting when these situations occur. Then developing and implementing that advocacy plan by explaining our needs that in a way that enable others to provide support. And we have to maintain clarity of communication. And the best way that we communicate, it may be through spoken word, just like we're doing now, or it may be through another means of communication. And then the disclosure, the reason why. Is it appropriate to do a full disclosure, the diagnosis, or just the aspect of autism that is causing the challenge at this particular time? And it's this greater self-awareness that allows us to meet our own needs and building better mutual understanding, trust, and fulfillment so that we can lead a fulfilling and productive life. Oh, there we go. And then finally, at the college level, I find developing one's own accommodations worksheet can be very helpful. For example, I helped a student develop a worksheet very much like this, who needed to advocate for herself at a community college. And what we did is we wrote down some of her challenges. To the best of her ability, we described what might be causing this challenge. And then what are some suggested accommodations? And the reason why is that while counselors at a student support office might have a lot of skills and a lot of education in supporting students with disabilities, it is the student, it is us on the autism spectrum who know best what we need. And the best way to prepare for that is to understand what it means to us to be on the autism spectrum and what are the implications of our sensory, cognitive, or social differences in terms of interacting and being productive, either in school, in education, at work, at home, or in the community. So these are some of the things that I think about in promoting effective self-advocacy. It's something that I work on all the time. Everybody can improve and get better at effective self-advocacy, including myself. I'm always working on figuring ways in which to be more effective, to advocate for myself and also advocate for others and to advocate for those of us on the autism spectrum as a community. So I think now it's about time for questions. Do I have the timing right?
Hi, yeah, so I think we're a bit out of time for questions. However,
Oh, it went a little bit too long.
That's okay. If people in the audience do have questions, then there'll be more information in our follow-up email after this event on how you can reach out to Dr. Stephen Shore.
All right.
So yeah, so thank you so much, Stephen, for your presentation. It was very helpful and insightful, and we all really appreciate it.